They banned books in 1933. We do it better. In 2026, we make books disappear. Oriane Cohen. May 10, 1933, Berlin. Opernplatz. 40,000 people gathered in front of the Opera House. University students from Humboldt, Munich, Heidelberg marched with torches and threw roughly 20,000 books into a bonfire. The books had been pre-selected from blacklists compiled by a Nazi librarian named Wolfgang Hermann. 9 categories of books, from Bolshevist to Jewish literature, morally depraved to pacifist, and un-German. The students didn't choose the books themselves. Someone else made the list. They just showed up and threw. Among the works consigned to the fire, Freud, because he argued the human mind contains forces it cannot fully control or see, because the self in his work is not unified, not transparent, not pure. Because if Freud is right, the idea of a clean, uncorrupted people becomes impossible to sustain. Einstein, because his work destabilized the idea of a single fixed frame of reference. He developed the theory of relativity, and a regime that needs absolute truth cannot afford an Einstein. Marx, because he insisted that power shapes what we call normal, because he made the invisible structures of a society visible, because visible structures can be questioned. Zweig, because his novels were populated by people who didn't fit, people torn between worlds, between identities, between loyalties, because ambivalence in his hands was not weakness, it was the condition of being human. This was exactly 93 years ago. And auto da fe, public book burnings, is never the beginning of something, it's actually the end of an invisible process. By the time the fire appears, the selection has already been made. The process has a function, the compression of a reality. When a system can no longer absorb complexity, it reduces it according to a sequence. Firstly, reality is reclassified, not debated publicly, renamed through language. Categories like Bolshevists replace analysis. Then visibility is reduced. What does not fit the dominant frame is no longer taught or cited, it stops circulating. Then the cost of defending it increases socially, professionally, but also politically. At some point, it disappears from the field entirely. The fire only comes last. Today, we don't need to get the fire, we do it better. Purification is justification layer. I want you to sit with one detail. The word the word Goebbels used was not censorship, it was re-inguing purification. The books were not framed as being wrong, they were framed as contaminated, and the contamination had a name. The name was complexity. Too many frame of references, too many contradictions, too many identities that refuse to collapse in a single line, in a system on the strain, that is Germany in 1930s, that becomes intolerable. So it is reduced. Now move to the present. No one is burning books in public squares and no longer needs to in many systems. The mechanism has been dematerialized. Content is ranked, surfaced, buried in systems optimized for engagement. Engagement is driven by clarity, speed, and emotional payoff. Complexity slows, fragments, and underperforms. Most people don't have the time or energy to process it. So, complexity is selected against, but not by the decree this time, by incentives. Today, alignment can be political, but also just market driven. Outrage travels, clarity converts, ambiguity stalls. A concrete example: weeks ago, a CIA former intelligence operator posted a video with a visual linking a well known public figure to the Mossad. He's doing that quite often. Strong image with a provocative headline guaranteeing high engagement under a steady presupposition. I clicked. I wanted to see if the claim would be substantiated. Of course, it wasn't. The video content, no evidence, no argument, actually, not even a reference to the Mossad at all. He used imagery for the thumbnail and the word Mossad for the title to make sure that you and I would click. This is how he makes a living. That doesn't make him an anti Semite, just an opportunist. This is the mechanism. How selection begins not by removing ideas necessarily, but by amplifying what performs. And once amplification follows incentives like money, the rest becomes harder to see, harder to defend, and eventually disappears. Mossad, Israel, conspiracy. These are high yield triggers. They generate attention. Attention generates reach. Reach generate revenue. So they are used because they perform. What's happening today is structurally different from 1933 and more dangerous. In 1933, the list was centralized by the regime. Today, the list is emergent. It is produced by engagement metrics, platform logic that we don't really understand. Behavior of the audience. No one writes the blacklist, the system does. And what does it select for? Outrage, anger, emotion, certainty. What does it suppress? Ambiguity, nuance, contradiction. Now let's return to the authors. Einstein's work was born because it destabilized fixed reference points. Today, single frame narrative dominates. Freud's work exposed internal complexity. Today, certainty is a virtue, doubt is a weakness, nuance is betrayal. Marx's work revealed structures. Today, the structures that produce the crisis are never examined. Only the individuals on the other side are guilty. Zweig refused clean identities. Today, ambiguity is penalized. No one needs you to burn anything now because you already do the job when you simplify. When you choose the version that will pass through the algorithm, when you self censor at dinners because you anticipate reactions, when you prefer to adjust because you don't have the cognitive bandwidth to handle the tensions and conflicts, the filtering becomes internal. Today the fire is gone, but the purification remains distributed, invisible, and inefficient. It lives in individual behavior, in the quiet reporting of content, because it is unwelcome. It lives in the algorithm that classifies certain ideas as sensitive content. It lives in the university database search that flags politically or scientifically sensitive terms for review. It lives in the conservation where someone types, is problematic, and the conversation stops. It lives in the daily habits of consuming a feed that has been curated by a machine optimized for outrage to confirm exactly what they already believe. And yes, you could say this is necessary. The platforms are just doing their job, that without filtering, everything collapses into noise, abuse, chaos. That would be partly true, but that's not the question. The question is what kind of world this filtering produces, what becomes visible, sayable, defensible, and what doesn't. Filtering removes noise, and by doing so, it also reshapes the field. Once the field is shaped, you don't need no fire. I have said this year repeatedly. Do not fall into binary thinking. I come from a tradition that does not have the luxury of simplification, a tradition that is forced to hold complexity, to look at the multiple facets at once without collapsing them into a single comfortable position. This is why everything in my work revolves around the gray zone as a necessity. Because the gray zone is where reality actually exists. When societies lose the ability to inhabit it, they do not remain in uncertainty. They try to resolve it quickly, sometimes violently. We are living through one of the most complex geopolitical movements in recent memory. And in that moment, the dominant intellectual reflex on all sides is to simplify. The fire was visible then. Today, the disappearance is cleaner. Nothing burns. It simply stops being thinkable. 93 years later, May 10th, 2026, read what is becoming expensive to think. Stay lucid. Oriane.